1, we looked at pop culture and how it influences our thinking about history. In part 2, I'm going to look at some of the structures that I visited that seemed a little bit off in regards to what we are told to be the truth. Here again is Ben McBrady explaining what he and many other cultures had believed happened many years ago.
The order of which I may be the last member, by tradition, came into existence after the last great cataclysm or catastrophe which affected the world. Now, with these great and terrible impacts on the earth by great electrical storms being caught up in the tails of meteors or showers of meteorites, civilization as we know it was totally destroyed.
And in Japan's case, we know what really destroyed the old civilization. So let's take a deeper look at the old structures in Japan. Now, most of the castles were built on a stone platform, but the castles themselves were made of wood. Now, sometimes that makes a lot of sense because of the need for a strong foundation and the easier use of wood to make the structure. However, wood kind of burns easily, and most of the castles in Japan have been burnt to the ground, leaving only the stone platform. More or less this fit the kind of logic you would find in Japanese structures, since most of the major structures, and some quite beautiful in Kyoto for example, are made of wood. However, the castle in Sendai is a little bit unusual, and while I'm not saying it wasn't built the way that they said it was, there are many things that kind of don't add up about this castle, and castles in general. The platform of the castle itself is about 4 football fields. There were 2 locations, both up on top of a hill with a 15-degree slope on it. I climbed it myself, and it's a very hard climb. They said it was built back in the 1600s, which means that there were no roads, no trains, only jinriksha, horse and cart or oxen cart. However, when you look at the site, the stones are huge. They are precisely cut, better than most castles, and are in 2 locations on top of a hill that cover about 4 football fields. So in the 1600s, which there's little information on the population of Sendai at the time, there were probably about 100,000 people at the most of them 5 foot, 5'3" on a low protein diet, many of them old or children or women who were likely in professions other than cutting and carrying large stones. They managed to build a castle with a view that burnt down 6 times. And it never occurred to them to maybe, if they're going to build a huge base out of stone, that maybe even part of the actual castle have a stone base to it. But maybe the taste of a narcissistic samurai needs the wooden castle with a room with a view. Now, I looked at the stones of several castles. The modern rebuilt ones are very poorly cut. You can see the markings on the stone. The castles that were in the middle of a city, they were mixed. Some were very precise, some were not so good. But these were incredible. They fit nearly perfectly, as you can see here. As I said, most castles were built in a city, in the middle of a city, so the residents, if they were under attack, could escape to the castle. This one was built on a very steep hill, which would of course made it very difficult for the city folk to escape to the castle. Having said that, there were two castles up on top of the hill. I would have thought that if the samurai were planning out castles, they would have put one in the city and one on the hill, which would have made more strategically and financial sense. They could protect the people who make the food for the samurai in the city, and if things got really bad, they could all escape up to the hill, or the samurai on the hill castle could come down and support the occupants of the city. Now, here's a map of a large city typical in Japan in the 1800s. You can see that there are very few buildings and it's sparsely populated. Imagine what it was like in the 1600s. Again, I find it very difficult that the local masonry collected all of these huge stones. They would crush a riniksha easily due to their size and weight. So that begs the question, did they really carry those stones up a 15-degree slope on horse and cart with only a footpath that leads up to the hill? Now again, they could have done it that way. I just think there's more to the story than what we're being told.
So getting back to the point, was there a previous civilization that was destroyed by some catastrophe and left these stone bases by a previous civilization with greater technology? Perhaps so. Other structures that are a little bit less well known are the kofun. These are burial sites, supposed burial sites throughout Japan. Here's a photograph of one. These are not so dissimilar to the stone structures that you find in Ireland and Scotland. Here is Ben McBrady again on the subject.
All knowledge came within the ambit of the order, but they were particularly concerned with astronomy because they had experienced so many very significant calamities, and it was thought that a full knowledge of astronomy would enable enable them to predict conditions when these calamities were likely to take place and take some kind of action to protect themselves. If you look at the great megalithic complexes in Ireland, you'll see that what are described as passage graves are really bomb shelters of a very primitive kind. They are well above any tidal wave level, and they also afford protection from meteoric showers. These shelters from aerial bombardment are very common, and they're well known. But what are not so well known, well, they are to archaeologists, but everywhere in the country you get souterrains, which are underground stone chambers. The archaeologists say, without any evidence, that they were stores for grain, mainly. But no grain remains have been found in any of the souterrains of significance, which would indicate that that was their primary function. They also served as shelters. They would shelter from outside conditions, and most of them would be well above sea level too, but not as high as the great megalithic ones. It would seem that the very complex ones, the very big ones, such as we get at Carrowkeel and Carrowmore in Sligo, were special ones, like Hitler's bunker, very well preserved, but they would be for special people.
Well, this concludes part 2. In part 3, I'm going to be looking at the psyche and the culture of people today versus what it might have been in the past. During my trip, I noticed I could read some people's auras more easily than others, and that was mainly because the older people, but not all of them, were more refined in their psyche than the younger people who seemed to be more like drones, clone souls, or the so-called NPCs. Now, this wasn't always the case, and I'll give some examples in the next video. However, it is kind of disturbing because it seems as though the society we have now is rapidly moving into a direction where spiritual growth has very little meaning. Well, that's all for this video. I hope you found it interesting. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.